Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Facing Change in Boreal Freshwater Ecosystems, Science, Indigenous Partnership and Conservation Planning. My name is Ashley Talbot. I'm the Director of Communications here at Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, and I will be hosting today's discussion. For those of you who might be new to WCS Canada, we're a national civil society organisation working across Canada. Our vision is a world in which wildlife thrives in healthy lands and seas, valued by societies that embrace and benefit from the diversity and integrity of life on Earth. We work towards this through a blend of on-the-ground scientific research and policy action, developing solutions to address conservation challenges, from the impact of climate change on wildlife and wild areas to the cumulative effects of resource development and other human impacts. Before we go further and introduce today's speakers, I'd like to complete a land acknowledgement, paying our respects to the Indigenous peoples and all our relations on the lands and waters where we're privileged to live and work. WCS Canada acknowledges that this event is taking place on the traditional territory of many nations. Our organisation works across many locations across what is now known as Canada, on the ancestral and unceded territories of Inuit, Métis and First Nations peoples who have called this land home since time immemorial. WCS Canada is committed to affirming the importance of Indigenous peoples' perspectives in local, national and global biodiversity conservation, and respecting the sacred relationships the Inuit, Métis and First Nations have for their traditional territories and homelands, and the stewardship based on respect, love, responsibility and reciprocity, which has, over countless generations, nurtured and sustained the lands, waters, plants and animals that WCS Canada considers important today, and without this we would not be. Thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce our two fantastic speakers who are joining me today, co-director of our Northern Boreal Mountains programme, Crystal Mantika-Pringle, and director of our Ontario Northern Boreal programme, Connie O'Connor. As well as being co-director of our Northern Boreal Mountains programme, Crystal is also an adjunct professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Crystal is based in Whitehorse, and she works closely with First Nations communities, governments, and other partners throughout Yukon to collaborate on meaningful research projects and land use planning initiatives that reflect Indigenous environmental values. Crystal specialises in understanding the impacts and interactions of climate and land use change on biodiversity and translating the implications into conservation planning. Connie is a freshwater ecologist and conservation biologist dedicated to finding conservation solutions for globally important freshwater ecosystems of Canada's boreal forests and the people and the wildlife that rely on them. Connie leads WCS Canada's research and conservation programme in the Ontario Northern Boreal landscape. Some of her current programme highlights include leading a lake sturgeon monitoring programme in collaboration with Moose Cree First Nation, identifying priority areas for freshwater fish biodiversity using conservation planning tools, and applying research results to improve planning, management and policy. So Crystal will be opening today's webinar and taking us into the expansive watersheds of the Yukon and exploring WCS Canada's freshwater work in this region, after which Connie will take the floor for an introduction to WCS Canada's work in the vast and complex socio-ecological systems of Northern Ontario. We'll close with a moderated Q&A with both of our speakers, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. A few bits of light housekeeping before I hand over to Crystal. Please supply any questions in the Q&A box throughout the webinar. We'll be triaging them as we go for the Q&A at the end, so please do send them over as you think of them. This webinar is also being recorded, so you will all receive the link to that recording after the webinar. I think that's everything from me, so without any further preamble, I'm really pleased to be able to hand over to Crystal.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and happy Earth Day. Next slide, please. Great. Folks might have seen this new paper come out. It's a global study where the authors, Hashemi et al., in 2026, just recently in Nature Water, published the world's high-value freshwater ecosystems. So these are the rivers, wetlands, headwaters, riparian zones, and floodplains across the world. And as you can see, Canada is the star, or one of the stars of the show, because we hold in second to Russia, almost 13% of the world's global land water interface that regulates so many ecosystem services. So our responsibility here is quite high for regulating hydrology, maintaining biodiversity, and carbon cycles. And I just wanted to start off with that because disproportionately, we have a large responsibility in Canada. So any decisions we make now or in the future about land use or energy development or even resource extraction and infrastructure have global consequences. Next slide, please. In that paper, it also highlights the importance of treating freshwater systems not just as individual lakes or individual wetlands, but as entire integrated whole watershed systems, including the headwaters as shown here, the riparian zones, floodplains, and even the adjacent terrestrial areas that help regulate water flows. I'd also add the importance of free-flowing and connected watersheds as well. So these areas, the responsibility is great because they control the hydrology and the water quality and also the carbon dynamics at the entire watershed scale. But ironically, when you go into most policy frameworks, they still focus on individual water bodies in isolation. Even in the Yukon, I can consider some sub-regional land use plans or national territorial parks that may have part of the watershed protected and others are outside of the watershed, including federal Canada's Water Act. So as a result, these freshwater systems still remain a blind spot in climate and biodiversity policy. And there's difficulty with that because the connection of headwaters to downstream effects and also considering rivers without borders. In the Yukon River is a classic example. It drains from BC to the Yukon to Alaska out to the Bering Sea. And so it's difficult to manage and conserve a watershed when it's split over different jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share some examples from the Yukon and starting off with the next slide to demonstrate for countries with relatively intact systems, particularly Canada and particularly in the northern Canada here. I'm going to share examples from where I live, which is in the Yukon, so top left. And you can see that we actually have little footprint. So protection of these landscapes are more important than restoring other landscapes that might be degraded, for example, in the south. So I want that to be my first take-home message of today. Next slide, please. However, even in the Yukon, it might be at a smaller scale than in the south. We still have development, particularly in valley bottoms, as well as floodplain regions. An example here is the Yukon River confluence on the top left. Up in the headwaters and upstream is the Goldfield, which is in the other photo of this slide. And you can see, I don't know if it's clear on your screen, but the impacts of the goldfields, which is placer mining, does impact the water quality. And so you can see the turbidity and the different color of the water at that confluence. And treating these spaces, even though it might be at a smaller scale than the south, it's still important because all of these development upstream add up and have an impact for downstream, rather than treating these areas as critical ecological infrastructure that would help moderate floods and store carbon and support biodiversity. And vice versa. If headwaters are fragmented, they regulate downstream hydrology. So if they're drained, then restoration would be quite difficult. Next, please. Other cumulative stressors include climate change. Warming is occurring here at twice the rate as it is in southern parts of Canada. And as a result, we're having increased permafrost thaw, which is in the photo on the left, the permafrost slump that's draining into the Takini River. And this increases the turbidity and smothers salmon spawning streams. We're also seeing increased forest fires in the Boreal system. It is sub-regional. Some areas are becoming wetter, but other areas are becoming more hotter and intense. And as a result, higher water temperatures. We're also facing a very uncertain new generation, one that has much global and national interest for our critical minerals, as well as Arctic security. Compared to when I first moved to the Yukon 8 years ago, the population here has grown by 6%. It's also grown by 26% since 2015. So in the north, we are seeing cumulative stressors, not just from climate change and energy development, but also from population growth. And as a result, more people to feed and more resources are needed. And this results in a cocktail of threats that our ecosystems are facing. Next, please. Not to mention the need for energy. Right now, we are limited for clean energy, as that one dam shown in my slide here, the Yukon River Dam, is at capacity. And due to our really long cold winters, particularly this last winter, we received 5 weeks of -40. And in December, we almost experienced rolling blackouts as a result. The solution is not more dams, because dams also fragment rivers and fragment critical salmon populations. Next slide, please. So how can we achieve success under so much uncertainty and so much cumulative stressors? I want to provide some examples from the Yukon. Our Northern Boreal Mountain Program is working in collaboration with 9 First Nations and as well as Indigenous councils on regional plans and Indigenous-led conservation areas, as shown as this photo. So areas in darker green is where we have worked for protection. Areas in the lighter yellow and in the grayer areas where we're currently working. Next slide. What this might look like actually varies quite significantly depending on our partnership and what the individual First Nations needs are. For Natchanai Dun, this has involved multiple years of mapping both traditional knowledge as well as Western science, identifying key hotspots for protection, including the headwaters, hot springs, clean drinking water sources, and overwintering fish habitat. And really responding to after they take their lead, we then increase the capacity to help nominate these protected areas. Next slide. For salmon, there we go. We helped blend traditional knowledge gathered as well as Western science through monitoring to monitor water quality, benthic macroinvertebrates, and salmon spawning in areas of high risk for mining, as well as to support the individual First Nations submissions for regional assessments. This was linked to a new hydro project as well as a new access road that a developer wanted to put in. And it involves 7 years of really long-term collaboration, and it's still ongoing for freshwater monitoring, as well as both desktop and field-based support, but just also a much broader partnership for a shared vision. And that was one that for protecting this intact watershed. Next slide, please. For Tronic-Quitchin, it's involved walking in 2 worlds and bridging knowledge systems for conservation and land use planning, particularly for the Dawson Plan. This has been another long-term relationship over the course of 9 years, and it's still ongoing. And it's involved with multiple years of interviews, policy writing, internal counsel, and partnered on-the-ground research for cumulative effects assessment. You're welcome to read more about the paper that just came out last year. But next slide, please. The main result has been a success story in that Tronic-Quitchin, with WCS Canada's support, submitted a plan for protection, which is on the left, which close to 70%. The Dawson Commission then took this into consideration. They also took into consideration other values, which was mineral potential on the land, and released a draft plan in 2021 that highlighted 37% protection, followed by a recommended plan, which is in the middle picture, of 34% legal protection due to the mining interests. As a result, we helped submit comments and worked with Tronic-Quitchin over a couple of years, and we helped bump up the cumulative effects thresholds as a result. On the very right picture, just recently, actually last month, the final recommended plan was released, and 48% of the region is now nominated for protection, which equates to about 4% of entire Yukon, or 19,000 square kilometers. Now, this is not a small scale. This is more protection than the entire country of Fiji or Kuwait. So this is very large regions that we're talking about in comparison to other global nations. The this is still ongoing because it hasn't been approved or it hasn't been submitted for modifications yet by the First Nation or by Yukon government. But I did want to highlight that this plan nominates wetlands of special importance. So there's Scotty Creek and Ladue wetland, as well as sub-regional planning for the Yukon River. Sub-regional planning has also been nominated for the Stewart River. Upper watersheds for cold spawning are included in some of the green land management units, as well as climate refugia, which we helped to nominate and map. Cumulative effects have also been lowered to reduce the total footprint allowed in the remaining areas. So the areas that are either highlighted in yellow or in lighter color, those are the integrated stewardship areas. And our team is helping to inform these cumulative effects thresholds through research. We have multiple projects on the ground, as well as we're supporting the advisory group for cumulative effects. Next slide, please. My final example I wanted to share is slightly bigger in terms of the watershed scale, and it's also further along because it's in the implementation stage. Some of you might have traveled to the Peel watershed. It's very well known. It's one of the most pristine watersheds in the country, with vast wilderness, intact rivers. Many people come here to paddle the Wind River and the Snake River. We have intact fish stocks. There's species of risk in this watershed and large migratory mammals. My colleague, Dawn Reed, wrote a science-based conservation assessment report as part of the planning process, and that was submitted to the Commission for consideration. And this helped plan the Commission to present a final recommended plan that recommended 80% protection for this watershed. And it drew on the science-based assessment, but it also drew on the First Nation visions. So again, it incorporated 2 knowledge systems. Last slide. Next slide, please. However, this process was a little bit more complicated politically because in 2013, the Yukon government, then the new conservative Yukon government, put forward a balanced plan that reduced the protection of the Peel watershed by of only 30%. So it went from 80 to 30%. As a result, the 2 First Nations and 2 conservation groups, including CPAWS, sued the Yukon government over its new plan for the Peel watershed and ran a Protect the Peel campaign. Then in 2016, the Supreme Court of Canada issued a decision on the Peel land use court case and upholded the treaty process for planning. And in 2019, the original Peel watershed plan was approved by all parties to go back to the 80% protection. And it's still ongoing because even last year we saw in the news that a recent feasibility had been approved for a proposed national park in the Peel watershed, which would be approximately 3,000 square kilometers. And next slide, please. Great. So I wanted to spark inspiration from the North and also highlight the importance of long-term relationships with Indigenous partners. Every partnership has looked different. The needs have changed depending on the capacity for both us as an organization, but also for First Nations. And it's been quite beautiful, but also messy at times, bridging knowledge systems and shared spaces for freshwater conservation. Sometimes there's been a place for Western science and scientific knowledge, but other times it's all Indigenous led, and we are there just to help champion the work and help spread the messages of the importance of conserving these intact watersheds. And I also wanted to highlight the importance of the North in particular in comparison to other nations for regulating climate and providing the world's high value intact freshwater ecosystems as shown in that first paper. And now it's over to Connie.
Okay, thank you, Crystal. for those examples from the Yukon, and also just I always love seeing the beautiful pictures of the Yukon landscape. I'm going to shift sort of gears and landscapes for our talk and take us from, the mountains and valleys of the Yukon and northern British Columbia to the vast lowland landscapes of northern Ontario. So next slide. So when I'm talking about northern Ontario, I'm talking usually about sort of roughly the northern half of Ontario, but also it's centered around Ontario, but also includes little pieces in Quebec and adjacent Manitoba. And this overall actually comprises the most intact forest landscape left on Earth. So it's a vast forest and peatland complex, and it is actually more water than land. It includes thousands of lakes and free-flowing rivers and one of the largest wetlands in the world. So next slide. Just to try to get sort of perspective on the scale, this northern half of Ontario is actually the size of all of Alberta. If you're in Toronto, it's as far from Toronto to Florida as it is from Toronto to the communities in northern Ontario, like Fort Severn, that are on the shores of Hudson Bay. But it would take a lot longer to travel from Toronto to Fort Severn than Toronto to Florida because there's no all-season roads in this landscape in northern Ontario. And overall, this whole landscape comprises diverse Indigenous cultural landscapes. So these are living, dynamic landscapes. There's enduring, reciprocal, and interrelated relationships between Indigenous peoples and the lands and the waters and the living and non-living beings. So first and foremost, this is a homeland. It's a homeland of diverse Indigenous peoples, including Ininuak, Iluluwak, Ininewug, Anishinaabe peoples. Next. And the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the lands and the waters have sustained these globally important ecological values. So as I mentioned, this whole region is largely roadless. There's a limited network of seasonal winter roads. There's 6 major rivers that cross this landscape, and 4 of these are completely free-flowing from the headwaters in the Boreal forest all the way to the marine landscapes of the Hudson and James Bay. The Severn River is the longest of these, and it's almost 1,000 kilometers long and free-flowing, and without these major industrial impacts from the Boreal Shield headwaters to Hudson Bay. There's all of these interconnected landscapes provide habitat for northern wildlife. So there's populations of forest-dwelling boreal caribou. There's migratory caribou in the north, wolverines, wolves, moose, millions of shorebirds, boreal songbirds. And then there's also within the rivers and the lakes and the ponds and the streams, there's the highest freshwater fish biodiversity with low human impacts in Canada. So it includes lake sturgeon, which is globally an endangered species. There's sea-run brook trout on the Hudson and James Bay. And of course, other northern species like whitefish, northern pike, walleye. Next. And one of the, again, sort of globally important ecosystem benefits in this landscape is these extensive peatlands. So Hudson Bay lowland is the second largest peatland in the world, and 1 square meter of these northern peatlands contains 5 times as much stored carbon as 1 square meter of tropical forest. So these boreal peatlands are really important for carbon storage and as globally as for climate regulation, because they accumulate carbon very, very slowly over thousands of years. And so these ecosystems are both very important, but also vulnerable, because if the carbon is disturbed or released, it can't be recovered under sort of any reasonable timeline for meeting climate change commitments. One thing that's important is that under all but the most extreme climate change scenarios, the Hudson Bay lowlands are expected to remain a carbon sink. But this climate benefit will only be maintained if the peatlands aren't disturbed or degraded through industrial development. And then next. But there is pressure for industrial development in what right now is a very intact landscape. So there's pressure for all-season roads and transmission lines from both communities who very understandably want improvements to their way of life and access to services, but also from industries that want infrastructure to support development. Right now, there's particular pressure for mineral extraction. This photo is Esker Camp in what is being called the Ring of Fire area by mining companies, which has been getting a lot of attention as a place where companies are pushing hard for development and roads and transmission lines to enable mineral extraction. Next slide. There's also increasing pressure, though, for other developments, including hydropower. There's pressure for smaller scale hydropower for local power for communities and also as a means of electricity for some of these proposed mineral developments. And there's also pressure for larger scale hydropower just as part of increasing electricity production as demand for electricity is growing in general in urban areas and for industry. So this currently very intact landscape is really feeling this pressure that is happening globally for minerals and energy. Next slide. So one of the key problems with the pressure for development is that right now there's no tracking of the cumulative impacts. So especially around mining, early mineral exploration happens over a much, much larger area than eventual mines will have a footprint. And there's no tracking of this early mineral exploration activity at all in Ontario. So for early exploration, it involves things like cutting lines to access sites, removing vegetation, taking rock samples. And on a small scale, these are relatively low impacts, which is why they're not tracked in any way. But the issue is that right now it's happening over vast scales. There's about 100,000 square kilometers of mineral claims in Ontario right now. And so at the broad scale, these relatively minor impacts like line cutting and removing vegetation can actually add up to significant ecological degradation across the landscape. Next slide. And then the sort of second major issue with these developments, especially some of the proposed developments, is that there can be landscape scale impacts of developments that might have a relatively small footprint on their own. And again, hydropower is an example of this, where upstream of hydropower, there's an increase in water, there's flooding. Downstream of hydropower, there's a decrease in water. There can be sedimentation and erosion from the changes in water levels. And also pathways for migratory fish like lake sturgeon or the sea-run brook trout are disrupted across the whole scale of the river. So this photo is just bank erosion downstream of a hydropower facility. So in either case, the landscape scale winds up being the relevant scale, both for considering the impacts and also for considering conservation solutions. And so protected areas are really important and they're part of solutions, but in landscapes like this, protected areas will be insufficient without also considering upstream impacts, downstream impacts, and at the landscape scale, how all these impacts are working together. So the approach that we have been pushing for is through proactive planning approaches, having evidence available for planning and equitable planning approaches with Indigenous people. So next slide. So I'm just going to try to give 3 examples of how we're trying to advance these proactive, evidence-informed, and equitable planning approaches at sort of different levels and different scales and with different audiences. So the first example is what we call the Ontario Mineral Tracker. And so this is a data democratization approach where, as I mentioned, right now there's about 100,000 square kilometers of mineral claims in Ontario. And these have increased significantly with the change to online staking, and then tracking commodities prices. So these little maps show the increase over the past decade in just the area covered by mining claims in Ontario. And right now, even if people want to be part of the decision making, it's really hard to even know that these claims are happening or where they're happening. So there's no requirement for consultation or notification when a mineral claim is staked. And the first opportunity for someone to even be aware that a claim has happened is when proponents apply for a permit to do early mineral exploration. And so at that stage, we make maps of all of the permits that are applied for. We have a email list and a Facebook page, and we highlight the nearby communities, the downstream communities, and also flag the contact for the right representative to get in touch with if someone had a concern or interest or wanted to know more about a mineral claim. So in this case, we're just trying to make information available for people so that they can be part of decision making. And then next slide. And then the next example is at a higher level where there's sort of amidst an overall push for deregulation and development, there are some examples that I think that offer hope in terms of planning in Northern Ontario. So since 2014 and even before that, WCS Canada has been engaged with impact assessment and pushing for more proactive, equitable planning process like a regional assessment that offer pathways for local communities to set out a plan of what they want prior to development coming in. So again, sort of one place that offers hope is that in January 2025, a terms of reference was released for a regional assessment between the federal government and 15 First Nations in Northern Ontario. And so this is, the first time in Canada that such a co-developed regional assessment has been put forward. And the Regional Assessment Working Group right now is working through the process of meeting the terms of reference that they set out. And so this is an opportunity to synthesize data and make recommendations. Although I'll also note it's not an authorization process in and of itself. And right now, Ontario is not part of this regional assessment. Again, sort of offering a place of hope. After effectively stopping land use planning in 2019, Ontario is now reinvesting in land use planning with communities, which also offers a pathway for communities to assert their right to be part of the planning process. And then next slide. And so the Ontario Mineral Tracker is an example of getting data out to just, anyone who is interested could use it. And the second is an example of being engaged at higher levels to try to push for different processes in terms of frameworks for planning. But then the third example I'm going to give is a bit more detailed and just an example of how we've been working with one community to help support knowledge gathering and information gathering to support decision-making and planning. So since 2015, we've been working with Moose Cree First Nation on what we call the Learning from Lake Sturgeon program. This is really a program about rivers and people and the ecosystems, but lake sturgeon are a culturally important species and they're globally endangered. And so they're sort of the ambassador for the ecosystem, even though the program is really more than the lake sturgeon. Next slide. And so with this program, we started with research co-creation. So we started by working together to design research studies that will gather information and then working together to analyze and share this information with the broader Moose Cree community, then also with Moose Cree decision makers and other decision makers in the system, and also with the science community for other people to be able to use these examples for their own work or to help sturgeon conservation in other areas. Since the beginning, we've been working with an elders advisory group to help guide this research. And then one of the things that the elders brought up was that the research needs to include youth training. So lake sturgeon are very long-lived. The oldest sturgeon that we've caught are older than me. And then the lake sturgeon are going to outlive, the younger lake sturgeon in the system are going to outlive everybody currently working on the project. So it's working with the species especially, it becomes really clear how important it is to work with the elders who also remember the history of the rivers, and then also to work with the youth to make sure that this work will carry on after we all retire and move on. So next slide, sorry. And then once we create this work and learn from youth and work with youth for the knowledge gathering, we also are working with Moose Cree to make sure that the results are applied to specific planning and management processes. So in this case, Moose Cree is a limited partner in a hydroelectric facility. They're part of co-planning for potential new hydropower. Moose Cree has also been pushing for decades to have one of the watersheds in the Moose Cree homeland recognized as a protected area. And so working with Moose Cree, we make sure that the knowledge that we're collecting is targeted to these processes, and then available to the folks who are part of the decision making. Next slide. Okay, so just trying to wrap up here. In sort of these intact and globally important northern ecosystems, piecemeal, inadequate regulatory oversight doesn't protect people or ecosystems. So it winds up pushing the costs onto local people. And it winds up not providing adequate safeguards for these globally important ecosystems. So in Ontario right now, there's often sort of a lack of information, lack of tracking cumulative effects, and a lack of equitable planning processes. But next slide. But amidst all this, I think there are some processes that offer hope. There are some examples of coordinated approaches that are still moving forward, such as the regional assessment or community-based land use plans that do offer an approach to provide greater certainty for proponents while also providing clear and evidence-informed approaches to ensure that important values are maintained, even as the desired development goes forward. We are trying to work to provide information to people that want to be engaged in these processes and to directly support communities that are engaged in these processes. And I think if these processes are sufficiently resourced and done in meaningful partnership, they can offer a much better approach for making sure that cumulative effects are managed across the landscape and that we're working towards a future where a lot of these globally important ecosystem services are maintained. Next slide. And then just to sort of wrap up and go back to what Crystal was saying at the beginning of the presentation, these are just two examples from the Yukon and from Northern Ontario, but there is a real opportunity here for Canada to be a freshwater leader. So Canada has incredible freshwater resources, and I think Canada has both an obligation and an opportunity to demonstrate leadership in prioritizing, sustaining these freshwater ecosystems, even amidst concern and pressure and a lot of discourse right now around extraction and energy and critical minerals. There's a vulnerability in the north. Northern landscapes are often, slow growing, slow developing. The peat accumulates slowly, the plants grow slowly, the fish and the animals live a long time, and so the landscapes can't necessarily recover, which again provides an outsized obligation to ensure that these values are maintained, because things like restoration just may not be possible in these landscapes. But it also means that there's an opportunity for large-scale solutions. And there's a critical role for Indigenous people in leading these processes and in science for providing evidence-informed planning and decision-making and information to make sure that we understand the consequences of decisions that are being made. And the next slide. This figure is just a figure of the free-flowing rivers that remain, and I think it shows really clearly these patches in the Yukon and in Northern Ontario where we do still have these free-flowing rivers. And again, just emphasizing the opportunity that when we're considering things like 30 by 30 and conservation targets, that we need to think at the scale of these free-flowing watersheds. And free-flowing and intact watersheds need to be considered and part of the picture for global conservation. So I think that's next slide. Yeah, that is just wrapping up, showcasing our landscapes and examples. And I think we're happy now to shift into answering any questions that people might have.
Amazing. Okay, thank you very much, both Connie and Crystal, for both of those presentations. We have a fairly hopping Q&A box going on here, so we're just going to jump straight in. And Crystal, I'm going to come to you first. Both of you have touched on projects that are deeply rooted in partnership with Indigenous peoples and designed with community priorities in mind. So could you talk a bit more about the process of establishing these partnerships and the roles of Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems in achieving the best outcomes for both ecosystems and people? And I can see we've also had a question into the box around how we kind of handle capacity issues with Indigenous partners and how we make sure that we're not overloading our partners with requests. So yeah, I'll come to you first.
Okay, checking you can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I started answering a couple questions, and I think there was one question that was similar to this one. And so I think I wrote in the box that the Western science that we present independently is just a tool. There are many, many tools for doing our work. And sometimes there is a place for it, and sometimes there's not. And so we let our First Nation partners take the lead on that and decide if it fits their agenda. And this is I guess the other thing that I wanted to share is the timelines. Like, timelines for science are very quick and productive, but the timelines for like conservation planning, we're looking at like 10, 15 years, even more, particularly for regional land use planning. And so it takes considerable amount of time. And so we're there for the long haul. And so those relationships and the reciprocity in terms of being there and supporting in other ways really shows in the depth of our kind of intergenerational work, because we're going now on the third generation of our work here in the Yukon. We've been here for over 20 years. My predecessor has retired, there's the next generation, and then we're also involving the youth. So making sure that we're there to help support if the Western science does have a place, and then others it's not, and it's Indigenous led, and we're just there in the background.
Amazing. Thank you, Crystal. Connie, coming to you next, how will the outcomes of the regional assessment be taken into account by the province in decision-making processes? Could they just ignore it?
So how do I answer this? I think the very short answer is yes. In theory, the province could just ignore it. And I actually do think the province is not part of the regional assessment because they don't want to be beholden to the findings that come out of the regional assessment. However, having said that, I don't believe that it is in the benefit of the province or the proponents or those that want to push forward development in this landscape to fully ignore a process that has been developed by 15 First Nations in the landscape. I think that I would hope at least that the public pressure and the sort of outrage from a group of people of ignoring 15 First Nations that put forward something from, working in good faith through this process and putting forward what they want to see for their communities, that couldn't be just sort of steamrolled over by the province or proponents. And First Nations do have rights in this landscape, and so I think that through those pathways there are important levers for making sure that this is upheld, even if there isn't a specific there isn't anything sort of like written down specifically that the province will be beholden to any of this, but there are the rights that can't be ignored. And I also, sorry, that is a bit of a rambling answer, but I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Connie. Crystal, coming to you next. How can the land use policy change to help a more regenerative or more helpful practice for the watersheds where developments are taking place? What is the worst or most difficult bottleneck that's currently preventing the adaptation of a better practice? Is it the general construction industry's business as usual, or lack of more in-depth Indigenous participation or influence over how land is developed?
Yeah, I saw that question and I didn't answer it on the chat because I thought it was too complicated. I'm just going to break it down and go for, because there was several questions there. And the regenerative approach, I'll respond to it first because in the Yukon and actually nationally as well, it's evolving, and particularly with cumulative effects assessments, they are evolving to be almost a justice tool. And for example, the Dawson Plan and the Peel Watershed Plan and the North Yukon Plan and so forth, cumulative effects are right now front and center, and they never used to be. So now we have a cumulative effects framework that highlights different values. The values tend to be quite high level. You know, it might be caribou migratory, it might be impacts on the land for hunting. The freshwater cumulative effects values are complicated, and I mentioned that, you know, the upstream, downstream make it very difficult to actually have cumulative effects thresholds for freshwater values, but we're working towards that. So one way to make it more regenerative is to have more adaptive cumulative effects tools, but also cumulative effects thresholds on the land that are careful and considered. And so that development does not happen in a boom and bust cycle. It has for the last 100 years. And we're very careful in terms of how much development and very place-based. Yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Awesome, thank you. So here we go. So we had a reflection from someone who said that they often feel in Northern Ontario projects are decided by politicians that purportedly represent the people. Seeing as the population in Northern Ontario is so little compared to the political base, we often feel steamrolled by decisions made by and for others. How can we Northern Ontarians deal with this?
I saw that was from Jim. So nice to see you as part of the attendees. I think this is a real challenge. And I agree. And I don't have an easy solution, but I do hope that through things like this webinar and just raising awareness for more folks about some of the challenges and also just how incredible Northern Ontario is, I hope that we can start to spread the word. If there are you know, incredible youth from communities in Northern Ontario who are doing great work, and just giving them voices and platforms and having them share their stories, I hope will, you know, cause ripple effects that will raise awareness about just how incredible Northern Ontario is, and also how important it is to listen to the voices from Northern Ontario who are actually on the land and being impacted by this. But yeah, I hope the few of us can work together to just bring awareness to the landscape and how amazing it is, and to the voices from people actually in the landscape who are oftentimes quite articulate and have a lot to say. So just giving them an audience.
Amazing. Connie, I have another question for you here, slightly different direction. Someone asking, what are some of the strategies you're finding successful for recruiting Indigenous youth to these types of programs and projects? With youth being pulled in so many different directions, we're finding youth recruitment tough to navigate or incentivize.
This is a great question. So we have, I think, we've had mixed success. And so sometimes we have great recruitment, and sometimes we don't have recruitment. And I think that's just an understandable part of the process. I think it's important to listen to youth about what opportunities are valuable for them, so that you make sure that you're matching the programming to either, you know, the specific training that they want, or the specific learning and opportunities that they're looking for. We make sure to offer things like honoraria, and we work really, really hard to make our programming no cost to the youth themselves, to make sure that it's equitable, just so that you're not asking of them to be part of the opportunities you're trying to provide, but that you're actually offering sort of programming and training that meets their needs and is what they're wanting, and is going to give them a benefit without providing a cost. And then I think we've been most successful basically with word of mouth. And just once you make one contact and, get them to tell their friend, and, we advertise on things like Facebook for the community, and posters and things like that. But I do often find that just sort of the old-fashioned word of mouth winds up being the most effective. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Awesome. Thank you, Connie. Crystal, coming to you next. So, somebody's asked how we go about implementing and enforcing regional plans. They've given the example of the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, which often doesn't get implemented. Do you have any reflections on this from the Yukon?
Yeah, Alberta is a tough cookie. But in the Yukon, where we have an umbrella final agreement and regional land use planning is mandated, I mean, the core interests are there, and it's culturally appropriate that even though we have a change in government, the regional land use planning process does not stop. So I guess the advantage is in the north, most of the land is co-managed, and we have Chapter 11 of land use planning. So ways that we can support that as individuals and ways that we can support that as partners is honoring that process, making sure that there's enough funding for that process, making sure those positions are funded, both for government as well as territorial government as well as First Nation government, and for positions within the Yukon Land Use Planning Council, as well as positions for the commission. So I would say, honoring the agreements, honoring treaties, and making sure that there's funding both with our nature strategy, but also funding through both territorial, provincial, and federal budgets.
Super, thank you. Connie, coming back to you, in practical terms, what rights do First Nations have with industry other than the right to be consulted?
So First Nations have rights to be consulted, but also have rights under the Canadian Constitution for access to, land and water and hunting and fishing. And those constitutionally protected rights mean that companies are also obligated not to infringe on those rights. And so then there's also rights that, Ontario hasn't said that they'll uphold UNDRIP and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but other provinces have. Canada has, committed to working towards that, although I think they could take stronger steps. But I think there are, at the global scale, rights of Indigenous peoples that are recognized really broadly that aren't always necessarily specifically recognized in the jurisdictions where we're working, but that we can still push for that. So I think looking at examples and precedents set by different levels, including some of these inherent rights and rights that are recognized under things like the United Nations, show that there is an umbrella of rights that aren't necessarily always being recognized under the current processes in Ontario.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got a question here that is probably one that maybe it would be nice for both of you to reflect on. So both of your presentations have touched on the impacts of cumulative effects. So what about planning processes need to change in order to move beyond the sort of project by project impact assessments that we're seeing taking place today? Crystal, do you maybe want to kind of come in on that first, on what that would look like in your mind?
Yeah, sure. So my expertise is actually in cumulative effects, and I didn't really go into it in detail, particularly around like on the boots ground research that we're doing, because we wanted to stay more high level. But I actually think about cumulative effects all the time in my work, in everything I do. And the best way for us to deal with it in the north, where area has relatively little footprint, is through regional planning, and not individual project assessments, because currently that is how we do manage cumulative effects, is by thinking of one project at a time, but it's not the best way. You have to really think of the entire watershed and really plan accordingly. And so the solution is land planning, and the solution is to go slow. So we need to really slow down and think about the planning first before approving any more individual mining projects.
Connie, is there anything you'd like to add on that one?
No, I think Crystal answered that really well.
Fabulous. Okay, well, we're going to come to you next, Connie. Here we go. So the question was regarding Ontario and special economic zones. Can be or will be set up for the Ring of Fire, and will override many protective laws. Do you understand this differently?
So I don't understand it differently. So my understanding of the special economic zones is that it does provide, essentially it's minister discretion to set up trusted proponents, but there's no criteria for what a trusted proponent would be. And then they would be exempt from effectively potentially any provincial or municipal law. But I think one of the frustrating things about working on Ontario, and especially for sort of the Ring of Fire areas, that there's actually very few regulations that would apply to that area anyways. And so, right now, Ontario, as an example, doesn't have environmental assessment for mines. So you wouldn't need a special economic zone to set up an exemption for an environmental assessment when it's not required in the first place. So in general, in Ontario, there is a need for, in my sort of opinion, a more robust regulatory framework in general. So, and then fewer exemptions to requirements like, but you need impact assessment in the first place. And then without I'm not sure if I'm sort of running out of steam here, not answering it correctly. But the issue with special economic zones in Northern Ontario is I think that they could exempt any law, but there's also just such a weak regulatory framework in Ontario to begin with that I'm not sure it actually makes a substantive difference in the Ring of Fire.
Excellent. Thank you, Connie. Crystal, coming to you. So Alberta's recent claim that it has reached the 30 by 30 target, so protecting 30% of land and waters by 2030, by including all public lands, is a significant departure from both federal and international standards. This move effectively rebrands Crown land, much of which is open to industrial development, as protected. So how do we approach this and ensure that non-park public lands are removed from the national 30% tally?
This is a good one. It's hard. I'm going to challenge it because I know we're also running out of time. There is science and also voices of Indigenous leaders that are significantly challenging the 30 by 30 rule. And particularly I'll give an example for salmon populations that we have some new research that is in review right now that challenges that target because we're still seeing populations decline even if 30% are protected. So we're really having to advocate for more, close to 70 to 80% protection. And Connie also mentioned this in the presentation that, we have to think about 30, but even more 70% of intact free-flowing rivers. It's not 30% of a fragmented river. It doesn't work like that. We have to think of the entire watershed. I would say look at the North as leaders in terms of how we're doing that. And in terms of the South, it's more focused on restoration at that point.
Fabulous. Thank you, Crystal. I'm really conscious we're running up on time. I think we've got time for one final question, and I'm going to put this to both of you. It would be great to kind of get a really potted response to this. But this is a question for both regions. What lessons from research on boreal freshwater ecosystem change can be applied more broadly to protecting freshwater systems across Canada, especially where climate impacts, governance challenges, and community priorities may intersect? Crystal, I'll come to you first because you were touching on kind of the leadership of the North.
Sorry, I'm going to ask Connie to go first because I'd like to see the question. I need to see it repeated.
Sure thing. Connie, are you happy to come in on that one?
Sure. I'll try to answer it really quickly. But I think any lesson I've learned is that it takes a lot of different people working together collaboratively and from a lot of different backgrounds. I come from a science background. I thought I would do science. And it turns out I do a little bit of science and then a lot of talking to people. And I've had to learn all kinds of different skills that I never thought I would need to know. And I've had to meet all kinds of different people who have different skills because it really does take people working together across lots of different levels of government and levels of jurisdiction and with different experiences and backgrounds. And I would say just the need for relationship building and talking to lots of different people and working with lots of different people is just how lasting conservation solutions have to come about. And so I think that general lesson of making sure you're just talking to lots of people, working with different people and reaching out to people who have the skills that maybe you don't have so that you can work together is something that is applicable across lots of different landscapes.
Awesome. Thank you, Connie. Crystal, just coming to you for any concluding reflections with that one.
Yeah, thanks. I was also had to reflect for a moment. Connie and I did not like go into details of like our individual research program because that's not like the main messages we wanted to share for today. But when it comes to research in the Boreal and for freshwater, or any research for that matter for WCS Canada, particularly for our Northern Boreal Mountain program, we want to ensure that one, timelines are not set with a prior agenda. This requires like continuous engagement, and that's both a success and a challenge because, you know, funding has deadlines, but also it can be a success in that we're here for generations and decades. Most of our research is co-produced with either government or First Nations. This increases buy-in and helps implement and create actions quite, you know, more quickly. And most of our research is very applied and really generally targets individual management questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, both of you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're a tiny bit over, so that's about all we've got time for. Thank you so much for submitting all of your questions. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get to all of them. It's been a really kind of hopping Q&A. So, you know, if you do have any questions that you'd like to follow up on, this recording will be circulated after the fact. Crystal and Connie's emails are included on the slides. So please do reach out if there's anything further you'd like to know about anything you've heard today or our research in these regions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. So bye-bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks for attending.